The red light was on. The cameras were perfectly positioned. The Hammersmith Apollo was filled with 3,000 people buzzing with the electric energy that always accompanied Britain's Got Talent tapings. At the judges' table sat the familiar four. Simon Cowell in his signature black t-shirt, arms crossed, that expression of mild skepticism already settling on his face. Amanda Holden, glamorous and smiling. Alicia Dixon, radiating warmth. David Walliams, ready with encouragement or wit, as the moment required. They'd been here thousands of times before. They'd heard every kind of voice, every type of song, every variation of dream and desperation that people brought to this stage. But none of them knew that in the next 5 minutes, one voice would stop everything. One voice would reach across 20 years and drag a buried secret into the light. One voice would prove that some sounds never leave you, no matter how hard you try to forget them. The production assistant's voice came through the speakers. Next up we have Grace Mitchell, 24 years old, from Manchester. The audience applauded as a young woman walked onto the stage with a quiet confidence that suggested she'd spent a long time preparing for this moment. Grace Mitchell was striking in an understated way. She wore a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back, minimal makeup, but her eyes carried something that made Simon look at her a moment longer than usual. Not nervousness, not excitement, something deeper, something that looked almost like purpose. She walked to the microphone stand and wrapped her hands around it with the kind of grip that suggested she needed its support. The stage lights caught her face, and for just a second, Simon felt something strange. A flicker of recognition that made no sense because he was certain he'd never seen this woman before. Amanda leaned forward with her usual warmth. "Hello, darling. Tell us about yourself." "My name is Grace Mitchell. I'm 24, I'm from Manchester, and I'm going to sing Songbird by Eva Cassidy." Grace's voice was steady, but everyone could hear something underneath it. Not nervousness, gravity, like she was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it for a long time. "And why did you choose that particular song?" David asked. Grace looked directly at the judges' table, and specifically at Simon. "Because it was my mother's favorite song. She used to sing it to me when I was little." "That's lovely," Alicia said warmly. "Is she here with you today?" Something shifted in Grace's expression. "No, she passed away 20 years ago when I was 4 years old." The audience made that sympathetic sound, that collective expression of sadness for loss. Simon nodded respectfully, but didn't say anything. He'd heard hundreds of stories about lost parents, about singing for people who couldn't be there. It was touching, but it wasn't unusual. "I'm so sorry," Amanda said gently. "But how beautiful that you're honoring her memory with her favorite song." Grace nodded. "She was a singer too. She auditioned for a talent show once, actually. She didn't make it through, but she never stopped loving music. I thought if I could sing her song, on a stage like this, maybe it would mean something." "It absolutely will," Simon said, and his tone was kind but professional. "Whenever you're ready." The music track began. The opening notes of Songbird filled the Apollo. Grace closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to sing. And the moment her voice emerged, everything changed. Simon Cowell's entire body went rigid. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, and everyone watching could see the color drain from his face, like someone had pulled a plug. Because that voice, that specific tone, that particular timbre, that exact way of shaping notes, he'd heard it before. He'd heard it exactly before. His mind was racing, pulling up a memory from so long ago he'd buried it, a memory he'd spent 20 years trying not to think about, a different show, a different stage, the same song, the same voice. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible, but Simon Cowell had heard over 100,000 voices in his career, and he'd never forgotten a single one that mattered. And this voice mattered because he'd heard it 20 years ago, and 3 months after hearing it, the woman who owned that voice had killed herself. Grace was singing beautifully, her eyes still closed, completely unaware of what was happening at the judges' table. The audience was swaying, moved by the performance. Amanda had tears in her eyes. Alicia was smiling, but Simon couldn't hear the music anymore. He could only hear the echo of that same voice from 2 decades ago, singing the same song, standing on a different stage, looking at him with hope in her eyes. And he remembered what he'd said. He remembered the exact words, "You're not ready for this. Come back when you've actually got something to offer." Simon stood up, not smoothly. He practically knocked his chair over. The sudden movement made Amanda jump. David looked at him, confused. Grace's eyes opened, startled, and she stopped singing. The music track continued for a few seconds before someone in the control room cut it. The Apollo fell into confused silence. 3,000 people wondered what was happening. The other judges looked at Simon like he'd lost his mind. And Grace Mitchell stood at the microphone, waiting. Simon's hand was trembling as he reached for his microphone. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I need to ask you something. Grace nodded, though she looked uncertain. Your mother, what was her name? Simon's voice was barely steady. Catherine Mitchell. The name hit Simon like a physical blow. He'd known it would be. The moment he'd heard Grace sing, he'd known. But hearing it confirmed made his knees weak. Amanda, Alacia, and David exchanged confused glances. None of them understood what was happening. The audience was completely silent, sensing something significant but not comprehending what. What year did she audition? Simon asked, though he already knew the answer. 2004, Grace said. She tried out for a talent show called Star Search UK. I was only 4, so I don't remember it, but she talked about it all the time. She said she sang Songbird because it was her favorite song and mine. Simon closed his eyes. What happened after the audition? She didn't make it through, Grace said simply. The judges said no. She came home and told my grandmother that her dream was over. 3 months later, Grace's voice caught, and she had to take a breath before continuing. 3 months later, she took her own life. She left a note saying that she'd realized she would never be good enough for anything, that the judges were right, that there was no point in trying anymore. The Apollo wasn't silent anymore. People were gasping, whispering to each other. Amanda's hand went to her mouth. Alacia looked horrified. David was staring at Simon with dawning comprehension. And Simon Cowell, the man who'd built an empire on brutal honesty, the judge who'd crushed thousands of dreams with calculated precision, stood at the judge's table with tears streaming down his face. I was one of those judges, Simon said, and his voice broke completely. I was the one who said no. The audience erupted, not in applause, in gasps, in shock, in the sound of 3,000 people witnessing something they'd never expected to see. Grace Mitchell stood on the stage, and for the first time emotion cracked through her composed exterior. I know, she said simply. I've known since I was 18. My grandmother finally told me the whole story. She showed me the rejection letter, the suicide note. I've known for 6 years that you were the judge who told my mother she wasn't good enough. Simon walked around the judge's table. Every camera in the studio followed him as he climbed the stairs to the stage and stood in front of Grace Mitchell, face to face with the daughter of the woman whose death had haunted him for 20 years. I am so sorry, Simon said, and there was no performance in it, no television persona. I was young. I was arrogant. I thought being harsh made me a better judge. I told your mother she wasn't ready, but the truth is, I was the one who wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to understand that my words had power, that what I said to people could destroy them. Grace was crying now, but she stood her ground. Do you remember her? Do you remember anything about her audition? Yes, Simon said without hesitation. I remember she was terrified. I remember she sang this exact song. I remember she was good, really good, but I was looking for star quality, whatever that meant. I remember she asked me if I thought she should keep trying, and I told her to find something else to do with her life. He paused, gathering himself. I remember that 3 months later, my assistant showed me a news article. Local woman takes her own life. There was a quote from her mother saying she'd been devastated by a recent rejection from a talent show. And I knew it was her. I knew my words had contributed to that decision. The Apollo was so quiet you could hear people breathing. I've thought about your mother every single day for 20 years, Simon continued. Every contestant I've sent home, I wonder if my words will be the ones that break them. I've tried to be more careful, more aware, but I can never take back what I said to Catherine Mitchell. I can never fix that. Grace looked at him, and everyone watching could see the moment of decision in her eyes. This was why she'd come, not just to sing, but to confront the man who'd rejected her mother, to make him face what his words had done. And now she had him. He was standing in front of her, vulnerable and broken, admitting his guilt on live television. She could destroy him. She could say the words that would end his career, that would turn him into a villain, that would be her revenge for her mother's death. But instead, Grace Mitchell did something that no one expected. My mother was fragile, Grace said quietly. She'd struggled with depression her whole life. Your rejection wasn't the only reason she gave up. It was the final reason, maybe, but not the only one. She took a breath. I came here angry. I came here wanting you to feel what she felt. But standing here now, looking at you, I realize something. You've already been feeling it. For 20 years, and I don't think carrying that guilt has made you a better person. I think it's just made you a sadder one. Simon couldn't speak, so I'm going to tell you something my mother never got to say. I forgive you, not because what you said was okay, but because holding on to this anger is killing me the same way it killed her. And I won't let your words have that power over both of us." The Apollo erupted. 3,000 people rose to their feet in an ovation that had nothing to do with singing and everything to do with witnessing something sacred. Amanda was sobbing. Alessia had her hands over her face. David was wiping tears from his eyes. And Simon Cowell, the most famous judge in television history, put his arms around Grace Mitchell and held her while they both cried. The cameras captured every second. The moment was so raw, so real, that even the hardened production crew was in tears. When they finally pulled apart, Simon looked at Grace and said, "Can you finish the song, please? Let me hear your mother's voice the way I should have heard it 20 years ago." Grace nodded. The music track started again, and Grace Mitchell sang Songbird the way it was meant to be sung, not as an audition, not as a performance, but as a prayer, a memorial, a declaration that some voices refuse to be silenced no matter how many years pass or how many people say no. When she finished, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Simon did something unprecedented. He pressed his golden buzzer. Then Amanda pressed hers. Then Alessia. Then David. All 4 golden buzzers going off simultaneously, something that had never happened in BGT history, something that technically wasn't allowed. Confetti fell from the ceiling. The audience was screaming, and Grace Mitchell stood on the stage where her mother had stood 20 years ago, where her mother's dream had died, and she finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother's voice had been good enough all along. After the cameras stopped rolling, after the audience had filed out, Simon asked Grace if she would stay. They sat on the edge of the stage, just the two of them, and Simon asked about Catherine, who she was, what she was like, what Grace remembered. Grace told him about a mother who sang constantly, who made up songs about breakfast and bedtime, who had the most beautiful voice Grace had ever heard but never quite believed in it herself. She told him about finding her mother's journals, reading about the audition, seeing how much hope she'd had, and how completely that hope had been crushed. She told him about the anger she'd carried, how it had consumed her teenage years, how she'd almost not auditioned for BGT because she was afraid of what she might do when she finally confronted him. "But then I realized," Grace said, "that my mother wouldn't want me to destroy you. She wouldn't want me to carry hatred. She'd want me to sing, so that's what I did." Simon told her about the guilt he'd carried, how Catherine's death had changed the way he judged, how he'd started really listening to people instead of just evaluating them. He told her that he'd tried to find her family years ago, to apologize, but couldn't locate them. He told her that seeing Grace on that stage, hearing that voice again, was like being given a chance at redemption he never thought he'd get. "I can't bring your mother back," Simon said. "I can't undo what I said to her, but I can promise you something. I will never, ever tell another person to give up on their dreams. I will never let my words be the reason someone stops trying." Grace looked at him. "That's all I wanted. For you to understand, for you to change, and it looks like you already did." The episode aired 6 weeks later, and it became a cultural phenomenon. Over 30 million people in the UK watched. The YouTube clip has been viewed over 500 million times worldwide. Mental health organizations played the clip in therapy sessions, in schools, in suicide prevention workshops. The message was clear: words matter, rejection can kill, and we all have a responsibility to be careful with the power we hold over others' dreams. But it also became a story about forgiveness, about a daughter who chose healing over revenge, about a judge who learned that being right isn't as important as being kind, about a voice that refused to be forgotten. Grace Mitchell was signed to Simon's record label the next day, not out of guilt, but because she was genuinely talented. Her first single, a recorded version of Songbird, went platinum in 3 weeks. All proceeds were donated to mental health charities in Catherine Mitchell's name. Simon became an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness in the entertainment industry. He established the Catherine Mitchell Foundation, which provides therapy and support for performers dealing with rejection and depression. He speaks openly about the guilt he carries and the lesson he learned. In every interview about that day, Simon says the same thing: "Grace Mitchell gave me a gift I didn't deserve. She forgave me when she had every right to destroy me, and she taught me that the most powerful thing you can do with pain is transform it into something that heals others." Grace keeps her mother's suicide note in a frame in her home, but next to it is a photo from that day on the BGT stage, the moment when all 4 golden buzzers went off simultaneously. She tells people that her mother didn't die for nothing, that her death changed the way one of the most powerful people in entertainment thinks about the impact of his words, that maybe, just maybe, Catherine Mitchell's tragedy prevented other tragedies by forcing Simon Cowell to be more careful, more compassionate, more aware. The Apollo now has a plaque on the seat where Catherine Mitchell's daughter stood. It reads, In memory of Catherine Mitchell, whose voice was silenced too soon, and whose daughter proved that some songs demand to be heard no matter how long it takes. 20 years. That's how long it took for Grace Mitchell to stand on a stage and sing her mother's song to the man who'd told her mother it wasn't good enough. 20 years of carrying a voice inside her, of wondering if she'd inherited her mother's talent or her mother's fragility, of debating whether revenge or redemption was the right path. And in 5 minutes on a Britain's Got Talent stage, Grace chose redemption. She chose to transform her mother's tragedy into a lesson. She chose to forgive the unforgivable. She chose to prove that her mother's voice and her own was worth hearing. Simon Cowell heard over 100,000 voices in his career, but he'll never forget the one he heard twice. Once when he was too arrogant to appreciate it, and once when he was finally humble enough to understand what he'd lost. The voice that reached across 20 years and changed everything. The voice that wouldn't be silenced. Catherine Mitchell's voice, living forever in her daughter's song,